This is Amanda from Classy Squid Fiber Company, and today I'll be doing a quick tutorial on chain plying. And here's a little skein that I have chain plied. This is the color we'll be working with today. This is my Amelia Rolex. And chain plying is a technique that can be used to turn a single strand of singles into what is essentially a 3-ply. And in order to do that, the reason it's called chain plying is because we're essentially creating a crochet chain and then plying that in order to get 3 plies. So why would you want to do this technique? There are a lot of reasons. One might be that you just have a single bobbin or 2 bobbins and you want to get a 3-ply out of that. Another reason might be that you want to maintain color repeats. So this is a striping colorway. And by doing a chain ply, we're able to keep those colors separate and ensure that we end up with the same striping sequence in the yarn as we did in the fiber. So that's another reason why you might want to do it. So with that, let's get to it. Okay, so I've got my wheel set up here and I'm using a slightly slower whirl for this. If you are just learning how to chain ply, I do suggest slowing down your speed a little bit, and I'm also doing it a little slower so it's easier for you to see while I'm demonstrating here. Other things that I've done to my wheel is I've increased my tension a little bit, and on the aura, that's done through this tension knob here. You can also raise and lower the head. And you want to have some tension while you're doing this technique. As you're chaining, you do need, as with any type of plying, you do need the wheel to be pulling the yarn in. And I'll talk a little bit later about why tension is so important with this technique. I'm also using a lazy kate. Now I have the Acreworks Acre Kate set up. Any kate that you have is fine. A shoebox is fine. You really just need your singles to be able to flow freely while you're working for this. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to put my kate on the floor behind me and I'll show you how to get started. So I have a leader here that has a loop in it, and chain plying is all just loops through loops through loops. So an easy way to get started is to go ahead and just do a slip knot. So I'll just take my single here, twist it around, and do a slip knot like you'd use for knitting or crocheting, and this will be our first loop. So I'm just going to put this right through the loop on the leader, and now we're ready to start chaining. Now before I start actually adding some twist here, I'm just going to demonstrate what the chaining motion is. So the general concept of what we'll be doing is just creating a crochet chain that has very large loops in it, and that forms our 3-ply. So I use my right hand for this, and I'll have fingers through the loop, pull the single up through that loop, and then I keep a finger inside this new loop that I'm working out of, and I continue to draw up the single through that loop, and we just continue this process all the way through. So that's just to show you quickly what that looks like before we start adding twist. And now I'll go ahead and undo that. There we go. And we'll get started. So I've got my loop, I've got my first live loop here, and I've got a finger through it, and we'll get started. So as I'm inserting twist, my front hand is going to gradually slide back while I'm tensioning all of the different strands here with my back hand. And that tension is important. There's a lot of things you can pay attention to while you're doing this technique for the first time, but something I would encourage you to really look at is just to make sure that all 3 of your strands are under tension. Because if they're not under tension, what can happen is one of the strands can pigtail, or you can end up with loops in your final yarn where these chain joins are that are a little bit bumpy. And if you maintain even tension, that will make it much easier. So I'll go ahead and get started, and then I will explain a little more of what I'm doing. Okay, so as I'm spinning, you can see that my front hand never leaves the plied yarn. It always stays pinching on that yarn. And one of the good reasons to do that and to not let go is that by doing this, by sliding along the whole length as I'm plying, I can feel if I get any weird bumps. So if I let up with this hand while I'm going, I can kind of introduce some more bumpy, uneven areas in here, and I can feel that with these pinching fingers if I keep them sliding along. So it's a good way to just ensure that you're being consistent. So every time I'm grabbing, I'm making sure that I'm pulling against the wheel. And this is why having your tension high enough is important. Mine seems to be set up just at the right spot, which is good, but if you're not able to maintain that tension, then just adjust your wheel to pull a little harder so that you can get that firm and even control over it. Now, one of the questions that I've been asked a lot is, what do I do if my single breaks? And the first thing I would say is that if your single's breaking, that is probably a sign that you do not have enough twist in your single. But there's nothing you can do about that now. You're in the middle of plying. So I'm going to actually break my single here and show you how we can rejoin it. So I've just snapped my single, and we're in the middle of a ply. Now the first thing to do is not panic and make sure that you're still holding on to your loop. Make sure that you still can identify where your different pieces of your chain are. If you are working with a non-superwash wool, which I am here, then one of your easiest things that you can do is just to splice this together. And that'll hold just fine in the ply, and I'll go ahead and do that here just to show you. So I'm just going to get that a little bit wet, rub that between my fingers, and you want to make sure that you never lose this loop. So I'm just going to slip this over my hand actually while I keep working on this to felt it. And we can just rub that together, and that is strong enough that we can keep going. Now, when you have put this down and picked it back up, you can see how this is all kind of wonky here. And this is what can happen if you don't have even constant tension on your singles. And so what you want to do is just manually untwist this a little bit so that you can open up your loop, pull back your single. And now at this point, I know that this is my loop, and this orange part here is what I want to be pulling through. And so now I'm back into my chain. The join is right here, and it is plenty firm enough to keep going. And with that, we can just get back into our rhythm and continue plying. Now, what if you are not working with a non-superwash wool? You're working with something that is superwash, or that has a lot of silk in it, or just doesn't want to felt and can't be spliced back together that way. So I'll show you another way that we can join this up. I'm going to break my single again. And one thing that you don't really want to do is to just tie a knot in this. Because if you do tie a knot, that will make a pretty substantial bump. And you can't really hide that in your finished yarn. So what we're going to do is unwind this a little bit just to give us some room to work. And I can see that I have my loop here, and I have my single, the other strand of that that's being pulled through. And so what I can do is I'm just going to lay these on top of one another and pull this through. I don't know if you can see that, but I'm just putting them really right next to each other without doing any type of attachment at all. And I'm going to very carefully do a short chain here. It's a little bit hard to show, but this is essentially like what you would do if you were doing a traditional 3-ply and one of your strands broke. You would just overlay those strands and then trap it all back together in the ply. And so I've got an end sticking out here, but that's okay. There's some overlap there, there's multiple strands. And so when we put twist back into this, I'll let that flow up and continue back with the rest of our singles. You can kind of take this end and just tuck it back inside as we continue along. And that will make a join that is plenty firm enough to hold up to use, because we're going to be knitting or crocheting or weaving or doing something with this yarn, and that additional twist and manipulation will help to lock that in. But that'll make a plenty firm join. I've got my finger stuck in here, and so we can just keep going. So the main thing is just to keep that even tension on all of your strands. I make kind of a claw here with my fingers as I'm chaining to maintain that. And another question that I've been asked is how to reduce the bumps in your yarn as you're chaining. So every time you do this chain, there is a spot right here where there is a little bit of a bump. And you can feel it while you're spinning, so it's probably hard to see, but I can feel this with my fingers that there's a bump there. Once you wash your yarn and set it and use it in something, you will likely not be able to find those again. But if it's something that bothers you, one thing that you can try, stuck a little piece of oil there, one thing that you can try is using your front sliding hand. Whenever you get to that bump section as you're plying, you can just give it a little bit of a rub. And what that does is it just compresses the single down a little bit in that area, and it can help to reduce the appearance of those bumps. And while you're doing this, you can also play with the distance that you are, how long you're making your chain. I tend to keep my chains fairly short, but if you're working with different colors here, so like I can see in my single that we're about to get to a color change. If you get to a color change and you're wanting to maintain your color arrangement, you can do a really short couple of chains as you're coming into that new color in order to control where those breaks are. Or if you want it to marl together a little bit, you can pull your single out pretty far. So here I'm into this light blue section pretty far now. And as this goes, you can see that we get that little bit of marling as it transitions into the next color, and that may be something that you want. So that's one way that you can manipulate the shades there. And even when I'm plying to maintain color changes, I do tend to just kind of fall into a pretty even chaining rhythm and let the colors come as they come. So there you have it. This is how I chain ply, and I hope that this was helpful for you to see. Everyone does this technique differently. Everyone finds different ways to hold their hands comfortably while they're doing it. And so I'd really encourage you to just play around with it, give it a try, and see what works for you and for your hands. There's no right way or best way to hold your hands while you're doing this. And it's a really great technique with a lot of good applications. So hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching, and happy spinning.